that you found.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming out to our inaugural Holland Office Museum staff presentation series. This is something that we've just devised, and we hope to do it every single month. Either Tyler or I, or maybe we'll even do something together. We'll present on something from our backlog of expertise. So today, Tyler is going to be presenting on one that he did a few months ago in relation to the wedding exhibit that he put together. So we'll be talking about 19th century weddings. So just got to turn that back on.
There it goes. I don't know why it's just lift the screen up. I don't know why it's doing that. Am I good?
I think so.
I'm gonna keep going off. Sorry, we've been having a lot of technical difficulties with this stupid thing. When they say technology is great, they lie.
It's great when it works.
Yeah.
That's expected.
And you know, why? Okay, well, anyway, I won't go back to that one. Well, I'm Tyler. I'm the curator here at the Holland office. So I started last year in June, if you don't know who I am. I am in charge of all the exhibit spaces in the museum and also the collection, which is over 21,000 pieces, which you may not think we hold that, but we certainly do. It's all upstairs. It's quite a collection, which if you come on the first Wednesdays of every month from 5 to 8 p.m., you'll be able to maybe go upstairs and see it with a tour from me. So just keep that in the back of your head. This thing's being stupid. Apologies. So 19th century weddings, I did this a couple months ago to kind of open the wedding exhibit, which opened in May, which some of you went in and looked at. So 19th century weddings are much different from what we're used to seeing today. It's a lot different. In just over 100 years, things have shifted greatly. So what was a 19th century wedding? So 19th century weddings were very small. They were held at homes or at local churches. There was often no reception unless you had money to have one. Most of the time during this period, which is known as the Victorian period, you often held your wedding at either the bride's house or at the bride's church. Sometimes you had it at a church, sometimes you did not, but mostly they were at churches, but the bride's parlor was mostly what they used. So that's kind of what the photo is in that corner, if it pops up. So right here, so this is kind of where you have your wedding, not at a banquet hall like we do now. We're at a lovely Cherry Hills banquet room. And it was just more low-key. Often you had very close friends and very close family members. You did not have an excess of people. It was very small, very knit. Which if you go into Heavenly Traditions Holy Matrimony, on the wedding cakes panel in that room, you see a photo of a 19th century wedding of a bride and groom cutting the cake. You can see that it is a lot of people. That was definitely an upper class wedding, but that was not the case for most weddings. I apologize, he's trying to fix this. The joys of technology.
You already had that problem once, on everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
Keep talking. You got it right here.
Not really.
You did all that work on it.
Yeah. So, also traditions, I'm looking at my laptop. This is called On the Spot. So wedding traditions have also changed, which is the main purpose of that exhibit. So this kind of stems from 19th century because that's kind of when weddings started to really pick up in the social light of everybody. besides your royal weddings, which have always been a polarizing social event in history, but kind of more of the common people's weddings started to really pick up during the 19th century. So traditions started to really develop, but they're very different than what we know today. So one of the biggest traditions is that it's all the bride's work. Back then, which is still similar today, but men are involved more than they used to be back in the 19th century. The bride and the mother-in-law would do everything. They would send out invites, they would create everything, they would go to the dressmaker themselves, they would get the men's suit themselves, they did everything, the men did nothing. Also, one of the funny traditions was that the brides would have to go on their bride tour, is what it was called. So, what a bride would do is they would go to various houses, they would pick out the people they would want in their married circle, which is your social life shifts when you get married. You're no longer part of this kind of debutante social life. You're not out anymore in society. You're now closed off. So you want a certain group of people in that circle. So those women that she went and picked out are now in that circle, and her other friend, she is now left behind. So you kind of cut off your life and enter a new one. So your bride tour, you go around and select your new social circle, and that's who you deal with now, and you don't go back. It's very different from what we see today. And it's very different levels of what social life was. Social life back in the 19th century was very coveted. That's what you followed. You follow the social code. Today, not so much. It's definitely changed. Also, another thing was that your soon-to-be husband had to be interviewed, which I don't know if your husbands or boyfriends ever had to be interviewed by your father and mother. I'm sure they probably wouldn't have passed. Mine wouldn't have, nor would my brother's wife. So definitely different, but so your soon-to-be husband, or your suitor is what it was called, had to go through an interview process, which if you ever watched the show Bridgerton, if you know what that is, you see that during the morning hours they have calling hours, and you see all those men come into that parlor room. That's kind of what it is. So you kind of go through this interview process. Your mother and father typically look and ask questions, just random kind of like, how are you going to treat my daughter? What kind of status are you in society? And they kind of depict you on that, not on your intelligence or your quality of personality. It's kind of what that is. So you go through that interview process, and then your father and mother tell you, yes, you can marry him, no, you cannot marry him. So it's not really up to the bride's kind of feeling. Unless you're in a working class family, then you kind of get to pick whoever you want to marry. So in middle to upper class, you're kind of told who you're marrying. So it's kind of arranged, but kind of not, because you're kind of being guided where you want to go. So it's very different and very interesting. But my favorite thing from the 19th century is the wedding dress history, which is what you guys get to really see in that front room. So in the front room, you get to go through over 140 years of wedding dress history. Wedding dresses have changed in a very short amount of time, even from the 1920s, so only 100 years. So during the 19th century, if you were upper class, middle to upper class, you often did wear a white gown if you could afford it. I couldn't afford it, that's for sure. So wedding dresses were very kind of normal, not normal, it depended. So during the 19th century, if you had money, you would wear a white gown. If you didn't, you would often buy a gown you could re-wear. So an example is the brown dress in the corner in the front room. That is a dress that is part of a middle class family. The Walker family is from Bergen, New York, right over up 33, down 19. If you go through North Bergen, you'll see the Walker family house. It's a great kind of gingerbread style house right across the street from the North Presbyterian Church. Esther Stacy Walker was part of a middle-class family, so that brown dress is made out of a crew silk, which is a very high-class silk fabric, but it's not white, it's brown. And if you look very closely at the bodice, you can see that she released her stays at some point. So that's a dress she re-wore and refashioned at points. It was more economical to do that rather than buy a dress you wear once. Like I'm sure most of you, where your wedding dresses are now in your closet or your attic, and that's where they live. Back then it was kind of more practical thinking. Unless you were the dress right next to her from 1889, worn by Kitty Parker Dennison. So the ivory dress that's in the front, right when you walk in, Kitty Parker Dennison wore that in 1889. That is definitely a dress she wore once. So that is also made out of the same fabric that the brown dress is made out of. It's an ecru silk. It's a very hardy fabric, but you can definitely tell it's a wedding dress. So that dress she definitely wore once. She never refashioned it, but that was because the Parker family was very high class in Batavia, New York. They had lots of money. She could afford to buy a dress and wear it once and then keep it away for the rest of her life. And now we have it 130 years later. So it's it's my favorite piece in the whole collection. That's why it's in the exhibit. It's definitely very fun, but I'll give you guys kind of a very quick tour of that room after, and I'll talk more about it, because that's where I'll talk about Queen Victoria and her kind of empire she created during the Victorian era, because it's named after her. So that will be fun to discuss, because since this isn't working, just enjoy. But what makes the 19th century wedding so coveted is, do you want to take any guesses? Anyone? Come on, play a game.
I know what you said.
Take a guess on why the 19th century weddings are so coveted in history.
There's a lot of history there.
No, it's actually because of the newspapers. So weddings became a huge social event during this period, so much so that people waited to read about these weddings. So a lot of 19th century weddings for everybody were covered in the newspaper. They detailed the bride's dress, the bridesmaids' dresses, the groom, what they did, where they got married. You got to live through the event through the newspaper. And luckily for us, a lot of newspapers have been digitized where we get to read about them now and get to see that. So in that room, you get to see a few newspapers that we have printed off that you guys get to read about the wedding with the dress. So the Parker dress has her wedding announcement in the newspaper right next to her dress and gloves. So that's why 19th century weddings are so fun for kind of fashion historians and 19th century historians, because it's so heavily detailed, you get to live that experience. And if you're a lower class person who can afford to buy a newspaper, you get to live that high class life without being a part of it. One of the greatest examples is I used to intern at the Morgan Manning House on Main Street in Brockport. We were supposed to have 2 of the family wedding dresses, and we were not sure if we did. But through the newspapers, because it's so heavily detailed, we were able to figure out that we did have both of the dresses. They detailed them heavily. One of them is a Jacques Jusset wedding gown from Paris. He was a couture artist back in the 19th century, the later years, which is a very highly coveted gown to have in a collection. So with that, we were able to piece together that these dresses were there. We did have them. So that's also why they're important today, is because we get to use those to kind of confirm things, which is what we did in that room also. But also in newspapers, you got to read about the bridesmaids. So the fun thing about bridesmaids back at this point was that they wore kind of the exact same dress that the bride wore. So during this period, there were lots of superstitions, lots of hauntings that were recorded. So the main reason why bridesmaids wore this same kind of attire, same color. Today, you would never think to wear white to a wedding. You'd be thrown out, or you'd be kicked out, or food would be thrown at you for wearing white. But back then, since there was so much superstition, there was this thought that evil spirits during your special day would come taunt you, or they would come wish harm on you. So what the bride would often have their bridesmaids do is wear almost the exact same dress and the exact same color so that the evil spirits would attack her and not the bride, which we do talk about in that exhibit with the bridal veil. So that's also the same thing with the veils. So veils prior to the 19th century weren't very common. They were for religious purposes, but then this superstition came along. So brides started to wear veils for the same purpose, to protect them from evil spirits. It's a very interesting superstition that we do not have a lot of history on. It's just been tracked throughout in certain sources, but there's never been a real explanation to why these have come about. Trust me, I've dug in lots of archives, I've tried to find it, it does not exist anywhere. It's been a trouble. So lots of superstitions, but that lasted until the 1920s. So bridesmaids often still wore similar things up until the 1920s, and then after the 20s into the 40s, things started to shift. So if you look at the bridesmaids panel, which I'll show you in the room, you can see a photo from the 1950s of the Ralph Parker family, also part of Kitty Parker Dennison. There's a photo from the 1950s where there are very different dresses, very different colored bridesmaids in comparison to Suzanne Morgan, who's on that same panel, where her dress is very similar to her sister's. So in just that short amount of time, things changed. And it's not been that long that your bridesmaids look different. So people often think it's been forever. It has not been. So it's been a lot of fun to piece those together and change them. Sorry, I'm still looking at my laptop to know where I'm going. These are the joys of doing the first thing on the first day. Another thing that was also very interesting during the 19th century wedding, did you know that at weddings we take hours of taking photos? Hours and hours and hours. I don't know if you know somebody who hates taking photos. My brother hates taking photos. He would love this tradition if it lasted till today. So back in the 19th century, obviously we did not have the cameras that we have today. So this goes back to Queen Victoria, actually. So on your wedding day, obviously you want a photo of you in your pretty gown, your husband next to you, you're happily married. However, you have to wait months back in the 19th century for that to happen. So Queen Victoria is a great example of this. Her wedding photos were done 6 months after her wedding was done. So so we can't say that she looked exactly the same as she did back on her wedding day. Things could have been different, things could have changed, like her hair, so we have actually no idea what she actually looked like on her wedding day. But those photos give you insight to what her wedding dress looked like, which did not change. So back then you had to wait because photographs took an awfully long time to do, to process, to take. So it was something that had to be executed properly. And also, you often went on a honeymoon for 1 to 2 months after your wedding, which is much different than today. You go on maybe a few days to a week. You went for 2 months, mostly. So again, that adds to the waiting period of getting your wedding photos taken, because you can't do them on the same day or prior to your wedding day, because then you're wishing bad luck on your bride and groom that they won't last, because that superstition still leads till today that you can't see each other before the wedding actually occurs. So you have to wait, and it waits for a long period of time. So that wedding photo that was on the front panel of the slides that you did see, that was probably taken months after their wedding occurred. Same thing with Queen Victoria, like I said. So very different traditions than what we know from today. But I will gladly take all of you into the front room and give you a real tour of the exhibit. That since nothing in here is working.
Yeah.
So this is Heavenly Traditions and Holy Matrimony. This is the wedding exhibit. This has been in the works since September of last year. So it's been a long time coming. So like I said, so these were the two dresses I was talking about earlier. So this is Esther Stacy Walker's gown from 1888. It is a brownie crew silk gown with steel cut buttons on the front. And the hat right next to it goes along with the dress. However, like I said, she refashioned it. So that hat is very 1890s. It is not from the 1880s. So you can definitely see that it was reworn at points. If you look really closely, you can see that there's color discoloration on the bodice due to her letting the dress out. So she definitely rewore it and got her money's worth out of it. Whereas the dress right next to it, Kitty Parker Dennison's wedding dress from 1889. So the Parkers were here in Batavia. They lived on Summit Street. She was a big name in her family. She came from a wealthy family, as you can tell. So this definitely shows you upper class and middle class. So it's made out of the same fabric. However, the color tells you everything. So this dress was definitely worn once. It was her wedding dress. We have the shoes and the gloves that go along with it. So it was definitely worn once. However, this dress is in a lot worse shape than this one. A lot of the lace was ripped off that I had to sew back on and fix. We did do a YouTube video on us, on me kind of conserving the dress with my know-how. Definitely not a conservator. But it was definitely a stark difference. So like I mentioned with the white wedding gown in Queen Victoria, which I'll go back to now that we're in here, and she's right there, right behind you guys on that panel. So Queen Victoria wore a white gown in 1840 to her wedding to Prince Albert, which was very different for her time period.
Yeah.
Also, so people often credit her with wearing the first white gown. That's not true. She was just the most influential, obviously, as you're a monarch and you're of the biggest empire of the world at the time. So she was the most influential, but she also broke many centuries of traditions with her gown. So a lot of times, British monarchs wore silver tissue gowns for their wedding to symbolize wealth and power. She wore white, and it was not made out of the country like most other gowns were. Her dress was strictly made in Britain. All the fabric, all the lace, all the orange blossoms were made in her country to show her power, her home, and show off who she was. So,
That's how.
and if you even go back just a few decades to Queen Charlotte, she got married in a silver gown, which is still in existence. It's at the V&A, I believe. It's a very simple gown, and Queen Victoria's is a stark difference from that. So she broke tradition with her gown beyond these two. So she is the most influential. However, white wedding gowns didn't really start to be in the public view for everybody until the 1920s, 1930s. That's when everybody kind of started to wear white gowns. But it did become more popular after her, which is why Kitty Dennison is wearing an ivory gown right here. But you could only do that if you could afford it. So you can definitely see the difference in social class here with the exact same fabric, just a different color, so she could rewear it, she could not. Definitely very different. Lots of frills, and definitely of the time where this was more simple and you could wear it out walking and doing something else. But what's so fun about this dress, because not a few decades ago were we just calling women by their husband's name. So when I found this dress for the exhibit, it was labeled Miss Truman Walker. Okay, that's great. That's not who wore this dress. You know, I mean, he could have. I don't know. I mean, he could have wore it, but I don't know who she was. That was the problem. So luckily, the town of Bergen historian Tom Tiefel helped me. So I knew he was a walker. I knew that he was from Bergen, so I pieced that together, obviously. So luckily, Tom had a lovely primary source to help me, which is right here. So this is the Walker Family Bible from the 19th century. It's from the 1840s, so it's in a little rough of shape. So he used this to find out her name. So Esther Stacy married Truman right on Main Street in Bergen, which is 19, which is a better reference. So using that, he was able to find out who she was. So I was able to give her proper notice on her gown. And also you get to see what actually married them, which is very cool. A lot of times Bibles don't really survive because they're used a lot. But this one, since it was like a ceremonial Bible, it was used for special events like weddings, communion, so it did survive longer than most. And it was a great source to figure out who she was and what happened, whereas this one, we knew exactly who it belonged to. It was great to have that on display. And also we have some other famous names in here for our local party, which are over here from the 19th century.
I just thought this.
So for the 19th century, like I said, women did everything. They're the ones that took care of invites. They are ones that took care of all the details. So one instance we have is John Martindale, a Civil War general who's buried over in the historic Batavia Cemetery. We have a wedding invite from his daughter's wedding in 1868. It's very low-key. It's just white with calligraphy on it and their big M stamped on it, whereas today you get these gorgeous invites with all this design. It's very simple, and it just tells you who it's for, when and where. Also, they're not mailed out months in advance, these wedding invites. There's often a funny story to go with the wedding invites. You want to get married to your bride as quickly as you can so she can't run away, or he can't run away. So you often mailed your invites kind of 2 weeks prior to the wedding. And then you'd make your travel. That's why it was very low-key, these weddings. You mailed out to people you knew would be there. Not 150 to 200 people months in advance. Also, another famous piece we have belongs to the Upton family. If you don't know who Emory Upton was, big name here, Civil War general during the war, big monument at the corner of Main and Ellicott. His niece got married in 1890 in Minnesota, so we have her wedding invite and certificate on display on loan from the historian's office of Genesee County. So another big name, but this one is a little more decorated, their wedding certificate, but their invite again is very plain. So it definitely shows you the time and kind of the difference of things. But yes, lots of fun. So 19th century weddings were very different from what we know today. But they did kind of create the traditions we have today with the white gown. The throwing of the bouquet was a thing during that period. And also if you look at the bridesmaids panel, that's where I was talking about the stark difference in what tradition was for a few years. So Suzanne Morgan is on the right. She is from the Morgan Manning House in Brockport. She's the middle sister. That is at her sister's wedding in 1893, where Sarah married Frederick Arnold Manning. So Suzanne was the bride maid of honor, but I didn't put a photo of her sister's gown because the only photo we have is from the 1970s when some lady is wearing it when she should not have been, so I did not want to show that off. So go with my word, but that is almost the exact copy of her gown. So her and her sister wore very, very similar gowns on their wedding day to protect Sarah from getting hurt. But Sarah had a tragic ending from her wedding. Her husband only lived 3 years. He died of tuberculosis, so I guess her sister wearing a similar gown did not help in that instance. And then we have a Ralph Chandler wedding right next to it in the 50s where dresses are very different. They're not similar. You can definitely tell they're not the bride. So it's very different in just a short time, which is now stuck for sure. Bridesmaids are definitely not wearing the bride's dress, that's for sure. And also another fun thing, which is easier to explain if you guys come over to the wedding cake panel. So who here likes wedding cake? Or dessert time at weddings? No? Maybe? Kind of? No? You know that lovely white cake that we all love, we all know? Well, that was just developed in probably the 1950s. Prior to that, you would have had fruit cake, which I don't really necessarily like in comparison. So wedding cakes have shifted a lot in history. Going back to ancient Roman times, what they used to have as a cake was a wheat or barley cake, which is probably better known as bread almost. Which not fun for you ladies, but the groom would take that and break it over the bride's head. So happy wedding day to you. So they did that to wish good luck and prosperity on the couple. That tradition didn't really last long, as I'm sure you could tell, because who wants to get hit over the head with a cake or a loaf of bread? And then, fast tracking many years into medieval Europe, wedding cakes then transformed again into what was known as spice bun towers. So you had these spice buns, which are about this big, and you used to stack them as high as you possibly could. The higher you could go, the better off the couple was in their marriage and not willing to divorce. So it was kind of a good luck charm in a sense. And then into the Victorian period and also the 18th century, the thing called bride's pie developed. Imagine a fruit cake with sliced meat. That was bride's pie. I don't think you'd want to eat that as a dessert. Does not sound yummy at all. So bride's pie or bride's cake developed as a sign of fertility for a bride. So again, tradition shifted, things changed, and the meaning shifted. So, however, it did not last long because it just does not taste or sound good at all. And then fruitcake took over. So fruitcake better than bride's pie, but not great. Anyway, took over for about 2 centuries. Queen Victoria had a large fruitcake at her wedding, which is also where royal icing came from. She was the only monarch to start having white icing on her cakes, which is why it's called royal icing. So she had a lovely white decorated cake. And another tradition that was at her wedding is that they used to give out a piece of cake to take home to every guest. That was a sign to try and find good luck. The more cake you gave out, the more luck you had. So there's her cake and her wedding cake box that she sent out with everybody. It has the royal crest on it and Buckingham Palace on it. However, until the 20th century, we finally came to our senses and created the white cake we know and love today. Much better than fruitcake, much better than bride's pie, and much better than getting hit over the head with a loaf of bread. So, wedding cakes also have not been around that long either. So these traditions that we think have been around for so long and we covet so much for our wedding days, they haven't been around that long. So, the 19th century is definitely where they start. They definitely flourish out of that realm, but they definitely don't take hold until the 20th century. So I hope you guys learned lots. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties.
Good job.
But if you have any questions or if you want me to explain anything else, I am more than willing. So just ask away.
There's like, by that one dress, there's like a little thing down on this. What is that? I'll show you. This little thing.
Oh, so this is out of the 19th century weddings period. So, what I am standing in front of right now is probably the most sentimental piece, not only to the exhibit, but also to me in this exhibit. So what you have in front of you are two dresses. So this dress over here, this ivory colored, is from the 1920s. It's Elizabeth Waterman's dress in November of 1920, and that's her daughter from 1949. So you have very different dresses, but what makes it so sentimental to me is that our volunteer Diane, these are her mother and grandmother's dress, but her mother sadly passed away at the age of 12 for her, so Diane's mom only lived till Diane was 12. She passed away very young. So there's Diane with her grandmother at her wedding. Her mom didn't make it to her wedding, so it was very sentimental to me to have that in here and have Diane be a part of that. So what's next to Diane's mom's dress, Madeline Thompson, is her ring pillow and her photo. So this is her. Yep. So this is her ring bearer pillow. This held her wedding ring in this little plastic thing that carried down the aisle. So, even though Diane's mom passed away when she was very young, luckily they saved this for Diane to have for many years, and now it's here in our permanent collection.
That's beautiful.
Yes. So it's a very sentimental story, and I'm glad that I got to do that with Diane and have her be a part of this and show off her mom and grandmother. Yeah. Any other
Do
questions?
you know if the rings made it up to the altar?
Yes, they did.
My nephew, who was 4 at the time, was the ring bearer,
Uh-huh.
and apparently he didn't like, and we were wise enough, you were wise enough, to put plastic rings on a pillow because he found it necessary to take those off and throw them somewhere. So
Yeah.
the best man and maid of honor had the rings up at the altar. So.
Yeah. Luckily, those made it down the aisle.
Yeah.
I'd be traumatized if that happened to me. And also what's over there, just to explain more. So, along with having Diane be a part of this, I also found her grandmother's wedding announcement and description that she did not have. So now she has it, it's in their family Bible. But what's under the photo are the gloves that she wore at her wedding. So we have everything but the shoes to go along with the ensemble. So very 1920s, it is a very spectacular gown. And also what's good about this dress is that this was bought at CL Cars also. So this is a dual object because it's one of the only pieces we have from CL Cars in existence still today. So very fun to have that. So you might see it again in an exhibit about CL Cars, maybe. Any other questions? I'm all ears, I can answer anything.
What is CL Cars?
CL Cars, so that was a huge department store. Everybody loved it on Main Street. It ran from about the late 1910s to the mid 2000s.
No.
It was a high end.
Yeah. Big department store. Now it's vacant.
Yeah.
And windows are busted out of the front, so gotta love when history is taken away.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
When did the bride and groom start mashing each other in the face with
Yeah.
the cake?
That was definitely in the 20th century. I don't think your bride would be too happy if you did that back in the 19th century. Also, you can't really do that with fruit cake. It's very dense and it's wet.
You could hurt your partner.
Yeah, and it's very wet also because you soak it in liquor. So I'm pretty sure if you smash that in my face and I got rum all over me, I would not be very happy. So that was definitely a 20th century development, which is now fading away even
Thank you.
now.
Good.
Because who wants frosting on them and all of that? So
Yeah, that's
definitely
true.
fading away now. But any other questions, comments? Anything that you saw in here you want me to elaborate more on?
Yeah, you've done a good job.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you.
Despite my technical difficulties.
That had nothing to do with you.
Oh, But our last piece from the 19th century, how could I even forget the oldest piece in the exhibit? So if you come over here, so this is the oldest piece in this exhibit. It is our oldest wedding dress. This is a wedding dress worn in February of 1832 by Lucinda Cox Glyden. She married into the Glyden family. So this is a dress that is also a representation of it not being white, and it was also refashioned at some point. So this is a wedding dress that was refashioned in probably the 1850s. The sleeves are very indicative of that with the shape and also the black velvet piping. So it was definitely refashioned at some point. However, this dress has suffered over the years due to its age not only, but also the very delicate silk that it's made out of. So it has deteriorated, which is why we kept it in the archival box to keep it nice and safe with its tissue and everything, so it's nice and sturdy instead of putting it on a mannequin and having people walk by and touch it. So some people don't notice it when they're in here, but it's one of my favorites because it's very blue, as you can still see. So the color is held for many years. So lots of fun with that one.
Usable. Usable.
Yeah. But yeah, any other questions?
That's awesome, thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much despite my technical difficulties. I appreciate you guys coming and listening and handling me in my rough situation. So thank you.
Saved by the Bell.
Yeah. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to contact me. We also have a bunch of other programs coming up this month if you want to know about them. I have a sheet in the East Wing that had them on there that I left in there. We have another great kind of presentation on the 24th of August. Redeeming, it's from Brandon Brooks, the curator at the gallery at Genesee Country Village Museum. He'll be presenting on the diabolical stripes and clothing with stripes on them and how they have very different meanings for different things. It's an amazing presentation. He's my old boss, so if you want to come and listen to him, he's a great presenter. So that's on August 24th at 11 a.m. So,
Wow.
but yeah, any other questions, I'm here, or my email's on our website. Feel free to reach out to me. So thank you guys for coming.